So when we introduced the concept of variables, we started talking about actually storing data to any given variable. That is, we put a string equal to a variable, or we put a number equal to a variable. This is a type of storage. Now, there are other types of storage that we can use to make our programs more robust. The first type that we're going to talk about is a list. So let's go ahead and jump into Python 3. And you're either going to just type out Python or Python 3, depending on what system you're in. This is going to bring us into the Python interpreter. Of course, this is also known as the Python shell, where we can write our Python code. It's denoted by the 3 greater than signs. This isn't the only place that we can write our Python code, but this is where we're going to start. This is what we're doing it now. So if you ever see these 3 greater than signs and Python above it, there's a good chance that you are working in Python, so you can probably write some Python code. It's pretty cool. So like I said, we're going to be talking about lists now. So let's actually revisit the concept of variables, and that is ABC equals to some string. Right? So ABC is a variable that we can use and we can multiply with, we can add to each other, and we can do all sorts of things with it. Now, of course, there's more things that we can talk about with strings and variables, but for now, what we want to do is talk about lists, also known as arrays. So depending on what programming language you're using, it's going to be called a list or an array. But a list is much like what you might think. So like item 1, this is item 1. And so on. Item 2, this is item 2. And right? So like that's a list. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so on and so forth. That's a human list. But we're not using a human list. Instead, we're using a Python list. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a list by using square brackets. So the square brackets themselves are actually, that's an empty list right there. And the list itself can be added to things. So if I put a string in here, so some string, my list now has one item in it, and that's some string. I can also put a comma. Once I put a comma, I'm adding the second item, but if I press enter, it's still treated as one item. So if I put 1, 2, 3 in here, I now have a list with a string and an integer, right? So this is now a list for me. I can put another item in here and say another string. Oops, I didn't put a quote at the end. So something that's really important about Python is, again, it's very, very literal. Most programming languages are. So if I mess up like this, if I don't end it with a quote, it's going to get mad at me. So I did it. Let's go ahead and put the quote back. Just by pressing up, I can get that last thing I entered. I press enter down, and now it works. So something else that I'm not doing well here is I'm not using the same kind of quotes. So when you are working inside of your code, it's very good practice, that is, to use the same, like, whatever you're doing. So if you're using double quotes, use double quotes throughout your program. If you're using single quotes, use single quotes throughout. So I'm going to stick with double quotes because there are other programming languages that want only double quotes. So we're going to stick with double quotes, and that's what we're going to do throughout. So now that we've got this, we have our array or list here. In Python, it's called list. In other languages, it's called array. I can now use this list much like I've used the string variables. So I can say list underscore var equals to, and I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste that list in there. And now I have this list variable, right? So I have a list of items in here. These items are actually stored in that list. So I can do things to this list. That is, I can append an item. So list var.append. So the list variable name, and then append some other item, and close it off with a parentheses. So append is a built-in method that allows us to hit enter. If I do list var again, I now see that some other item is there. That's really cool. So basically what I did is I added, this is how you add, or this is a way to add an item to your list. You can also do list var.pop. And what .pop does is it's going to remove the last item in the list. So we see list var now. We see that one we added is no longer there. So that's pretty cool. We now know how to add and remove items from a list. So it's not perfect because what if I want to remove the first item or the second item or so on? How do I do that? That's something we're going to talk about in just a second. But the first thing that I want to say is we can also do len, so length of the list var, and that will actually give us that. So len we can also do for a random string inside of len. It will also give us the number of items inside of that string, including spaces. So what we see here is we get the list length of any particular list. So there's 3 items in this list. Now, how do we actually identify each individual item, right? So like, how do I reference 1, 2, 3? How do I get that? Well, the way lists work in programming are a little counterintuitive to how they work in real life. So when I'm writing a list in real life, I'll say item number 1, go to the store, right? Item number 2, go pick out my stuff, right? And then so on. And then item number 3, and like it's going to start with 1. In programming, it starts with 0. So some string, we would look at it as, hey, that's in position 1, so that's item number 1. And then in 1.123 would be item number 2, and then 3, and so on. But in programming, it's shifted one way. So if I did list underscore var, used the brackets again, and put 0 inside of here, this actually gets me the item that's in position 0, which is that very, very first item. It skips position 1. Or it doesn't start with position 1, it starts with position 0. So if I'm like, hey, will you get me whatever's in position 1? You would say, okay, well, do you mean some string or 1, 2, 3? Because it's kind of an ambiguous question. But if I said, hey, I want the first item in the list var, would you actually tell me what that first item is? And then that's when you'd use 0. And then the one in position 1 is actually 1, 2, 3. And then the one in position 2 is actually list var 2, and that's another string. So 1, 2, 3. So item 1 is in position 0. Item 2 is in position 1. This is kind of confusing, so let's do another one. And I'll say ABC equals to 1, 2, and 3. Right, so this is kind of how we expect a list to normally work. If I said ABC, I want the first item in ABC, you would say the first item is 1, right? That makes sense. Now, how do I call that first item? I do ABC bracket 0 bracket. That's how you call that first item. If I wanted the second item, it's ABC bracket 1. Basically, whatever number you're looking for, subtract 1, and you'll be able to get that item. We're going to be using that a lot, but basically, it's allowing us to call that item itself by its position. Lists are based off of position, right? So the last item is 3, so we can actually use position 2. The number, the value of that last item is in position 2 is 3. Cool. Very complicated, or can be very complicated, but trust me, once you work with it more, it won't be as complicated. So I'm going to do it again, and I'll say another list equals to Justin, John, and Matt. Okay, so another list, press enter, and we get that list. If I wanted to get the name Matt from this list, and I want to set it to another variable, so this is the challenge. I'll say Matt underscore name equals to another list, and now what position? That's going to be 2. So I do Matt name, I now see Matt. Right, cool. So that is how we actually work with lists and their position points. So what we can do is we can also say the original list. So we'll just say the list equals to 1 and 2 and 3. And now I can do the list.pop, and we'll do position 0. And that's 1. And now if I look at the list, I see that there's only 2 and 3 left. So I can actually pop position 0 again and again. And now if I try it, it's going to say the list is empty. Right? So pop actually removes it from the list, and it removes it based off of its position. So let's define that list again. And then we'll do pop again. And this time we'll do 2. and I'll try and do it again, and now it says pop index out of range. So the index of 2 is out of range because the list is now just 1 and 2. So if I did the list and I tried to get, the position 1000 and press enter, and not this list, but the list, oops, it'll say that again. So the list index out of range. So basically, this call is only going to work when you actually have that number in there. And to know that, you can use length of the list to know how many items are in there. So if there were 1,000 items, length of the list would actually tell you that. So then you could get, then you would be able to get the position of 332 or 23 or whatever, if there was actually that many inside of there. That's something else that's pretty important. Okay, so that's some of the basics of lists. We are definitely going to come back to lists. It's just nice to know some of these things. But now that we understand lists a little bit, we're going to jump into dictionaries.